It started with a little girl falling to the floor in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and pencil shavings. But what really collapsed that day was the silence her whole family had been carrying for years. This ain't just a story about illness. It's about the kind of pain that grows when no one's allowed to speak, and how one child's quiet collapse made a whole town finally start listening. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. Leia's grandma, Mary Monroe, was the kind of woman who made biscuits at 4 a.m. just so the kitchen smelled like love when the sun rose. Her hands were rough from 50 years of gardening, kneading dough, and wiping tears, both her own and others. But her heart? Soft as butter left out in July heat. She'd stand at that old Formica counter, flour dusting her apron like snow, humming hymns she learned at her mama's knee. Amazing Grace was her favorite, though she'd change the words sometimes when she thought nobody was listening. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, ... and all my kin who need savin' too. But love's a funny thing, ain't it? Planted in poisoned soil, and even the strongest roots twist. Her son, Jason Leia's daddy, was a man carved from oak and stubbornness. 6'2", shoulders broad enough to carry the world, jaw set like concrete. Good intentions? Sure, he had M by the bucketful. But good intentions don't fill a child's empty belly when pride gets in the way of a skin for help. Jason Monroe was raised by a daddy who believed children should be seen and not heard, that tears were weakness, that a skin for help was begging. So when his own little girl started holding her belly and whimpering soft at night, he'd ruffle her dark hair and say, "Monroes don't complain, baby girl. We're strong stock. Whatever's hurting, it'll pass." And Lord, how that child wanted to be a Monroe, wanted to make her daddy proud. So when the pain started sharp and sudden, like a knife between her ribs, she'd bite her lip till it bled, learn to swallow her whimpers like bitter medicine. Mary knew, though. Grandmoms always know. She'd find Leia curled up on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m., little fists pressed against her belly, rocking back and forth like she was trying to comfort herself. Mary would gather that child up in her arms, carry her back to bed, and sit beside her till morning came. "Hush! Now, little sparrow," she'd whisper, smoothing Leia's fever-damp hair. "Grandma's here." Grandma's here. But what she wanted to say, what burned in her throat like swallowed fire, was, "Tell me where it hurts. Baby, tell me so I can fix it." But Leia had learned her lessons well. Monroes don't complain. Monroes are strong. So she'd force a smile come morning, eat her breakfast even when it felt like swallowing glass, and trudge off to school with her secret tucked tight in her chest. Bodies keep score, though. Always do. And hers? Well, hers was writing a tragedy in bruises and swelling, in sleepless nights and hidden tears. A story that couldn't stay hidden much longer. Miss Emily Hayes had been teaching 3rd grade for 15 years. Long enough to read the signs that most folks miss. The way a child flinches when you call their name. How they hold themselves when they think nobody's looking. The telltale signals that something ain't right at home. She noticed how Leia'd hunch over her desk like she was protecting something precious. How her pencil grip got tighter when her belly cramped, till her knuckles went white as church linen. Miss Hayes had a daughter of her own knew the difference between a tummy ache from too much candy and something ... deeper, darker. Week by week, she watched Leia fade, like a flower pulled up by the roots, but still trying to bloom. The little girl who used to raise her hand for every question now sat silent, arms wrapped round her middle. Her laugh, once bright as Christmas morning, became something forced, something painted on. Miss Hayes tried talking to her, gentle like, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. "You feeling all right today, sweetheart?" she'd asked during lunch. And Leia would nod, force that smile, and say what she'd been taught to say. "Yes, ma'am. Monroes don't complain." That phrase, "Monroes don't complain," it followed that child like a shadow. Miss Hayes heard it so many times, she started, wondering if the Monroe family motto was going to be carved on a little girl's tombstone. She tried calling Jason, left 3 messages on his answering machine, each one more urgent than the last. "Mr. Monroe, this is Emily Hayes, Leia's teacher. I'm concerned about her health. Could we schedule a meeting?" But Jason Monroe was a proud man, and proud men don't like teachers telling them how to raise their children. So Miss Hayes did what teachers do when the system fails a child. She watched and waited and prayed to a God she hoped was paying attention. Then came the Tuesday. October 15th, a date that'd be burned in Miss Hayes' memory till her dying day. The leaves outside were turning gold and crimson, like the world was setting itself on fire before winter came to bury it all. Leia was working on her math problems, tongue poking out the side of her mouth, the way children do when they're concentrating hard. Miss Hayes was helping another student when she heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the clatter of a pencil hitting the floor. She turned to see Leia gripping her desk, knuckles white, face pale as a winter moon. The little girl's lips were pressed together so tight they'd gone bloodless, and her whole body was trembling like a leaf in a storm. And then ... she just dropped, like a marionette with cut strings. 1 second she was sitting upright, the next she was folding in on herself, then spilling out of her chair onto the cold linoleum floor. The classroom erupted. 23 8-year-olds suddenly faced with something they couldn't understand, couldn't fix with a Band-Aid or a hug. But Miss Hayes? She was already moving, already kneeling beside that crumpled little form. And when Miss Hayes lifted that little girl's shirt to check for injuries, some things, once you see them, they change you, rearrange something fundamental in your soul. What Miss Hayes saw that day wasn't just a sick child. It was a crime, a sin against innocence itself. Bruises, purple and yellow as fading storm, clouds spreading across that little girl's belly like spilled paint, and the swelling, Lord have mercy, her abdomen distended tight as a drum, skin stretched so thin you could see the veins underneath, blue as river water. Miss Hayes had seen enough, called 911 faster than a preacher calls for salvation. Her voice, when she spoke to that dispatcher, was steady as bedrock, but her hands, they shook like autumn leaves. "This is Emily Hayes at Lincoln Elementary. I have an 8-year-old girl, unconscious, severe abdominal distension, possible internal. Injuries. Send paramedics immediately." She gave the address, the room number, all while keeping one hand on Leia's forehead, feeling for fever, checking for signs of life. When them paramedics rushed in, they took one look at Leia, and their faces went grim. Professional masks slipped just enough to show the horror underneath. One of them older fellow with kind eyes shook his head and whispered something that made Miss Hayes' blood run cold. How long has she been like this? They worked on her right there on the classroom floor, while 23 children watched through the window from the hallway. 4 lines, oxygen mask, gentle hands checking vitals and whispering medical terms that sounded like foreign prayers. "We need a surgical team standing by. Possible bowel obstruction, signs of internal bleeding. 8 to 7 minutes. The lead paramedics." Voice was calm, professional, but Miss Hayes caught the look he exchanged with his partner, the look that said they might not make it in time. As they lifted Leia onto that gurney, small and pale as a broken doll, her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, focused on Miss Hayes with the kind of clarity that only comes at the edge of everything. And Miss Hayes? She took that little girl's hand, squeezed it like she was anchoring her to the world, and made a promise she hoped she could keep. You didn't complain, sweetheart. You were brave. So very brave. Sometimes the longest distance in the world ain't between two places. It's between the moment something breaks and the moment someone finally decides to fix it. Jason Monroe got the call at his job site, was laying concrete for a new driveway when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Monroe? This is Dr. Sarah Chun at Children's Hospital. Your daughter has been admitted. You need to come immediately. Took him 23 minutes to get there, running every red light, cursing at every slow driver, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. When he burst through them hospital doors, still wearing his work clothes, cement dust in his hair, he looked like a man fleeing the apocalypse. Found Miss Hayes sitting in the waiting room, still in her teacher clothes. Grading papers in her lap like normalcy was something she could create through force of will. When she saw Jason, she stood up slow, like she was carrying the weight of the world. Where is she? Jason's voice was rough as gravel. What happened to my little girl? Miss Hayes met his eyes, didn't flinch, didn't look away. She collapsed in class. Internal injuries. They've taken her into emergency surgery. Surgery? What kind of surgery? What did you people do to her? Jason's voice carried down them sterile hallways like thunder. Other families turned to stare. Children pressed closer to their mamas. Nurses paused in their rounds. Miss Hayes, bless her heart, didn't back down. Stood there facing down a man twice her size, her voice steady as stone. Mr. Monroe, your daughter has been sick for months. Months. I tried calling you, tried to. You got no right. Jason roared, spit flying, finger jabbing the air between them. Ain't nobody asked you to call nobody. That's my daughter, my blood, my responsibility. That's when Mary Monroe walked through them doors. 70 years old, wearing her good church dress and the kind of expression that could stop a charging bull. She'd driven there in her old Plymouth, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight she'd left nail marks in the plastic. Jason Michael. Monroe, she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades. You lower your voice in this house of healing, or so help me God, I'll lower it for you. But Jason was a wounded animal now, all pain and rage with nowhere to go. Mama, they had no right. Taking my girl, putting her under knives, making decisions that ain't theirs to make. Mary walked right up to her son, this big man reduced to a frightened boy, and placed her work-worn hand on his cheek. Child, she whispered, when pride becomes more important than love, we stop being parents and start being strangers to our own children. That's when the surgeon came out. Dr. Martinez, been cutting on children for 20 years, seen every kind of parental love and neglect you could imagine. His scrubs were still damp with sweat, his face carrying the kind of tired that comes from holding someone's life in your hands. Mr. Monroe, I'm Dr. Martinez. I need to speak with you about your daughter. Jason spun around. Mary reached for his arm. Miss Hayes held her breath. The whole waiting room seemed to lean in, like the world was holding its breath. Sometimes the truth comes dressed like salvation, and sometimes it comes wearing surgical scrubs and carrying news that'll remake a family from the ground up. Dr. Martinez spread them x-rays on the light board like he was laying out evidence at a trial. Black and white images that told a story no parent should ever have to hear. Jason stared at them, shadows and shapes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This, the doctor said, pointing to a dark mass on the films, is an abdominal tumor. It's been growing for months, possibly longer. The size ... single quotes. He paused, choosing his words careful-like. Mr. Monroe, I'm surprised your daughter was still walking around. The pain she must have been in ... single quotes. Jason Monroe went down like a felled tree. Just ... collapsed into that plastic hospital chair, his head falling into his hands. All that anger, all that bluster, drained out of him like water from a broken dam. "How bad is it, doctor?" Mary asked, her hand finding Jason's shoulder. "Don't sugarcoat it for us. We can handle the truth." Dr. Martinez looked at this grandmother, saw the steel beneath the white hair, and spoke plain. "Without surgery, she won't see Christmas. With surgery, there's hope, but it's extensive. We're talking about a 6-hour operation, major complications possible. She need blood transfusions, post-surgical care, weeks of recovery." And Mr. Monroe ... single quotes, the doctor's voice softened. "I need to ask you something difficult. How long has your daughter been complaining of pain?" Jason raised his head, and Miss Hayes saw something break in his eyes. She never complained. Monroes don't complain. I taught her ... single quotes. His voice cracked like a boy's changing. "Oh God, what did I teach her?" "She tried to tell me," he whispered through his tears. "In her own way, she tried. The way she'd curl up on the couch. How she stopped eating her favorite foods. The way she'd hold her stomach and say she was just tired. Just tired ... single quotes." Mary pulled Jason's head to her shoulder, this big man sobbing like the lost child he'd suddenly become. "We're going to fix this," she whispered fiercely. "You hear me, son? We're going to fix this. That little girl ain't going nowhere. Not on my watch." Miss Hayes watched as Jason signed them, surgical consent forms with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. Each signature was an admission of failure, of love, of the desperate hope that it wasn't too late to save what mattered most. As they wheeled Leia into pre-op, she was conscious enough to see her daddy through the medication haze. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice smaller than a church mouse. "Am I gonna be okay?" Jason took her little hand in his big, calloused one. "Baby girl, you're the strongest Monroe I know. And Daddy's gonna be right here when you wake up. Right here, I promise." For the first time in months, Leia smiled, really smiled. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, little sparrow. More than all the stars in the sky. Faith, they say, is what carries you when hope runs out. But sometimes they both show up wearing surgical masks and carrying miracles in their steady hands. 6 hours. That's how long Dr. Martinez said it would take to save Leia's life. 6 hours for Jason Monroe to sit in that waiting room and reckon with every decision he'd made, every sign he'd missed, every time his pride had stood between him and his daughter's well-being. Mary knitted, fingers flying through yarn, like she was weaving prayers into every stitch. Miss Hayes graded papers the same set she'd been carrying since that morning, using the routine to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering into dark territories. Jason ... Jason just sat, stared at them surgical doors, like he could will them to open through sheer force of wanting. Every 20 minutes or so, he'd get up, pace to the water fountain, drink from a paper cup that tasted like regret, then sit back down. "I failed her," he said around hour 3, the words falling into the quiet like stones into still water. "My own daughter, and I failed her." Mary looked up from her knitting, eyes sharp as the needles in her hands. "Jason Michael, you listen to me good. Failing would be walking away right now. Failing would be letting pride keep you from learning better. You're here. That's what matters." Miss Hayes set down her papers, looked at this broken father, and spoke truth like medicine. "Mr. Monroe, I've been teaching for 15 years. I've seen parents who genuinely don't care, who send their children to school hungry and hurting, and never give it a second thought. You're not one of them. You love Leia. Sometimes love just ... gets twisted up in what we think love should look like. Hour 4 brought Dr. Martinez out for an update. Still in scrubs, still carrying that controlled urgency that surgeons wear like armor. "We've removed the tumor," he said, and 3 people released breaths they didn't know they'd been holding. It was larger than the scans showed, but we got it all. Clean margins. "She's stable. 2 more hours," the doctor continued. "We're repairing the damage, making sure everything's connected properly. She's a fighter, your daughter. Strongest little girl I've seen in 20 years of doing this." Hour 5, Jason started talking. Not to anyone in particular, maybe. To God, maybe to himself, maybe to the ghost of his own daddy, who taught him that emotions were weakness and asking for help was surrender. "My daddy used to say that Monroes handle their own problems. Didn't matter if you were bleeding, didn't matter if you were scared. You handled it yourself, or you weren't much of a Monroe." He laughed, but there wasn't no humor in it. No. What that taught me, that being a Monroe meant being alone. Even when you're surrounded by people who love you. Mary reached over, took her son's hand. "Your daddy was a good man in many ways, Jason. But he was wrong about that. Being a Monroe means taking care of each other. Means swallowing your pride when someone you love is hurting. That little girl in there? She's been carrying our family's stubbornness like a burden. Teaching her that pain doesn't matter, that needing help makes you weak. What kind of legacy is that?" Dr. Martinez came out one final time, pulling off his surgical cap, a tired smile creasing his face. "She's asking for her daddy," he said. And Jason Monroe stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. Some miracles come wrapped in surgical gauze and measured in heartbeats. But the real miracle? Sometimes it's learning that love means letting people see you scared. When Jason saw his daughter lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes, but smiling, actually smiling, something fundamental shifted in his chest. Like tectonic plates rearranging themselves around his heart. Daddy? Is it over? The hurting? Leia's eyes were bright with medication and hope, her small hand reaching toward her father with the kind of trust that can break a man's heart and rebuild it all at once. Jason took her hand, marveled at how small it was in his own calloused palm. "Yeah, baby girl, the hurting's over. And Daddy's gonna make sure it stays that way." His voice was rough with emotion, but steady. Steady for the first time in months. Over the next 3 days, that hospital room became a classroom. Not the kind with blackboards and desks, but the kind where souls learn what they should have known all along. Jason learned to ask Leia how she felt, really ask, and wait for real answers. Mary taught them both that strong families bend without breaking. And Miss Hayes? She visited every day, bringing homework and hope in equal measure. "Your class made these for you," Miss Hayes said, spreading 23 handmade cards across. Leia's blanket. Each one was a small masterpiece of crayon love. Stick figures holding hands, rainbows promising better days. Messages spelled in the careful script of 8-year-old hearts. "Tell them I said thank you," Leia whispered, running her fingers over the cards like they were made of gold. "Tell them. Tell them Monroes do complain sometimes. And that's okay." Miss Hayes looked at Jason, saw him nod with something that might have been pride, but a different kind than before. The kind that comes from watching your child learn to ask for what they need. Dr. Martinez made his final rounds on a Thursday morning that smelled like antiseptic and new beginnings. "Medically speaking, she's ready to go home," he told Jason. "But Mr. Monroe, taking her home means taking on a lot of responsibility. Pain management, follow-up appointments, watching for signs of complications. Doc, I spent 8 years teaching my daughter not to tell me when she was hurting. Figure I can spend the rest of her childhood learning to listen. Really listen." Dr. Martinez smiled, the kind of smile that doctors say for the families who get it. "She's going to be fine, Mr. Monroe. Kids are resilient, especially the ones who have people fighting for them." As they packed up to leave, Leia looked around that hospital room that had been both prison and salvation. "Daddy, can we do something different when we get home?" "What's that, baby girl?" "Can we ... Can we maybe tell each other when things hurt? Like, before they get really bad?" Jason knelt beside her bed, eye level with his daughter, and made a promise that would reshape their family. "From now on, little sparrow, we tell each other everything. The good stuff, the bad stuff, the scary stuff. That's what families do. That's what Monroes are going to do from now on. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as the worst day of your life. And sometimes it takes nearly losing everything to remember what everything really means. Coming home from the hospital ain't like coming home from vacation. Everything looks the same, but you see it different. That's how it was for the Monroe family that October morning when they pulled into their gravel driveway with Leia sleeping in the back seat, still pale but smiling in her dreams. Jason carried his daughter into the house like she was made of spun glass and hope. Mary had spent the night before cooking comfort food that smelled like forgiveness. Chicken and dumplings, cornbread, green beans from her garden. The kitchen table was set with her good dishes, the ones usually saved for Thanksgiving and Christmas. "Welcome home, little sparrow," Mary whispered, smoothing Leia's hair as Jason settled her on the living room couch with pillows piled around her like soft clouds. "How are you feeling, baby?" Leia considered the question, really considered it, the way she'd been taught in that hospital room. "My tummy's sore, Grandma, and I'm tired, but not the scared kind of tired, the getting better kind." Jason felt something loosen in his chest. His daughter had just complained, told them exactly how she felt, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it felt like it was just beginning. The weeks that followed were like learning a new language. Jason, who'd never been one for talking about feelings, found himself checking on Leia every few hours. "How's your pain level, baby girl? On a scale of 1 to 10? It felt awkward at first, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet, but gradually it became as natural as breathing. "Daddy's here if you need anything," became his new refrain. Not "tough it out" or "Monroes don't complain," but "Daddy's here." 2 words that carried more healing than any medicine Dr. Martinez had prescribed. Mary taught them both the art of gentle questions. "How are you feeling today, really?" became the morning greeting. "What do you need right now?" replaced assumptions about what strong people should want. And slowly, carefully, the Monroe house became a place where truth was welcome. Miss Hayes came by every afternoon for the first 2 weeks, bringing homework and gentle encouragement. But more than that, she brought the outside world to a little girl who was learning to be brave in new ways. "Your classmates want to know when you're coming back," Miss Hayes said one Thursday afternoon, settling into the chair beside Leia's bed. "Tommy drew you a picture of the class hamster. Says Mr. Whiskers misses you. Can I tell them about my surgery?" Leia asked, running her fingers over Tommy's crayon masterpiece. "About how the doctors fixed me? Maybe? Maybe if other kids know it's okay to tell grown-ups when you hurt ... single quotes." Miss Hayes smiled, the kind of smile that teachers save for moments when they see learning happen in ways textbooks never teach. "I think that would be very brave of you, sweetheart. Very helpful, too." Jason appeared in the doorway, holding a glass of Mary's sweet tea and wearing an expression that was still learning how to show worry without shame. "How are we doing in here?" "Good, Daddy. Miss Hayes says I can tell my class about getting better. About how it's okay to ask for help when you need it." Jason nodded, settling the tea on the bedside table. "Sounds like you're going to teach them something important, baby girl. Something it took your old daddy way too long to learn." The morning Leia returned to school, she walked through them doors different than when she'd left. Not just because of the surgery scar hidden beneath her favorite purple dress, but because of the way she held herself, like someone who'd learned that asking for help didn't make you weak, it made you wise. Leia, the chorus of her classmates. Voices could have powered the whole school. 23 8-year-olds who'd spent weeks worrying about their friend, making cards, asking Miss Hayes daily when she'd be back. Now here she was, pale but smiling, ready to reclaim her place among them. Miss Hayes called for quiet, but her eyes were bright with tears she wouldn't let fall. Class, Leia has something she'd like to share with us. Something important. Leia stood at the front of the classroom, her hands folded in front of her. The way Mary had taught her when speaking truth required courage. The room fell silent with the kind of attention children give when they sense something real is about to happen. I want to tell you about being sick, Leia began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. For a long time, my tummy hurt really bad. But I didn't tell anybody because I thought asking for help meant I wasn't strong enough. But you know what I learned? Asking for help is actually really brave. And grown-ups, the good ones, they want to help you. That's their job. That's how they show love. Tommy raised his hand, his face scrunched with the kind of concentration that comes with processing. Big ideas. So it's okay to tell if something hurts? It's not just okay, Leia said, her voice carrying the authority of experience. It's important, because bodies are trying to tell us things, and we need to listen. The questions came, then gentle and curious. Sarah wanted to know if the doctors were nice. Marcus asked if she'd been scared. Little Jenny, always the empath, wondered if Leia's daddy had been worried. My daddy was really scared, Leia admitted. But you know what? Being scared for someone you love isn't bad. It means you care. And caring is the most important thing grown-ups can do. Miss Hayes felt something shift in her classroom that day. Not just in Leia, but in all of them. 23 children learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that needing help was. Human, that speaking truth could save lives. As the children filed out for recess, chattering excitedly about Leia's return, Miss Hayes pulled her aside. How do you feel, sweetheart? Really? Leia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Tired, she said honestly, but good tired. Like I did something important. You did, Miss Hayes assured her. You taught them something that might save their lives someday. You taught them that their voices matter. Truth, once spoken, has a way of multiplying. What Leia shared that day didn't stay in room 3B. It went home in backpacks and hearts, changing dinner table conversations and bedtime prayers throughout their small town. Word spreads fast in small towns, especially word about children, teaching grown-ups how to love better. By the end of that week, Jason Monroe's phone was ringing with calls from other parents, other teachers, other families who'd heard about a little girl brave enough to speak truth to power. Mrs. Patterson from down the street called about her grandson Tommy, who'd been complaining of headaches, but whose parents thought he was just trying to get out of school. Dr. Chan's office reported a 30% increase in parents bringing children in for wellness checks, just to be sure, just to listen, just in case. Miss Hayes started a new tradition in her classroom, Wellness Wednesdays, when children could share anything that was bothering them, physical or otherwise. No judgment, no dismissal, just listening and helping them find the right grown-ups to talk to. My stomach hurts when Mommy and Daddy fight, shared little Marcus during the second week. By Friday, his parents were in family counseling, learning how their arguments affected more than just themselves. Sometimes I can't sleep because I worry about stuff, admitted Sarah. Her parents, who thought her restlessness was just a phase, scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist who specialized in anxiety. Jason Monroe found himself in a strange new role, the father other fathers called when they needed to learn how to listen. Men who'd been raised the same way he had, taught that emotions were weakness and children should be seen and not heard. "How do you do it, Jason?" asked Bill Henderson, whose 8-year-old daughter had been hiding bruises from playground bullies rather than being a tattletale. "How do you get them to tell you the truth?" "You start by telling them it's safe," Jason replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of hard-won experience. "You tell them that their feelings matter, that their pain matters, that they matter. And then, this is the hard part, you mean it." The Monroe house became an informal headquarters for this quiet revolution. Mary's kitchen table hosted coffee sessions where parents shared stories, fears, and small victories. Miss Hayes stopped by regularly bringing resources and gentle guidance. "You know what I realized?" shared Janet Cooper, mother of 3, during one of these kitchen table sessions. "I spent so much time trying to raise strong children that I forgot to raise children who felt safe being human." Nods around the table. Tears in eyes that had seen too much suffering born of silence. Dr. Martinez, who'd operated on Leia, started noticing changes in his practice too. More parents bringing children in early, asking questions, refusing to accept it's probably nothing when their parental instincts said otherwise. "I've been doing pediatric surgery for 20 years, he told his colleagues during a medical conference, "and I've never seen anything like this. An entire community learning to listen to their children. It's not just preventing medical crises, it's preventing traumas that would have lasted lifetimes." The ripples spread beyond their small town. Miss Hayes was invited to speak at educational conferences about creating emotionally safe classrooms. Jason found himself on panels about redefining masculine parenting. Even Mary, who'd never considered herself a teacher, started mentoring young mothers at their church. But the most profound changes happened in the quiet moments. In bedtime conversations where children shared their daily struggles without fear. In morning check-ins where "how are you feeling?" became as routine as brushing teeth. In families, learning that love wasn't about being strong all the time, it was about being honest all the time. And the answer, always and forever now, yes, baby. Daddy's listening. Daddy's always listening. Spring came early that year, and with it, changes that ran deeper than seasonal shifts. The Monroe family had settled into new rhythms, not perfect ones, but honest ones. Jason had learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. Mary had learned that wisdom sometimes meant stepping back and letting others find their own way. And Leia had learned that her voice mattered. They planted sunflowers that spring. Leia's idea, born from a conversation with Dr. Martinez during one of her follow-up appointments. Sunflowers always turn toward the light, he told her. No matter how crooked they start, they find their way to sunshine. Standing in Mary's back garden, dirt under her fingernails, Leia looked up at her daddy with eyes that sparkled with mischief and wisdom. Just like families, right, Daddy? Even when we start crooked, we can still find the light. Jason knelt beside his daughter, watching her pat soil around tiny seeds with the same careful attention she now gave to everything in her life. "That's right, little sparrow." "That's exactly right." Mary joined them, her old knees protesting, but her heart soaring as she watched 3 generations learning to grow together. "These flowers are going to be beautiful," she said, but she wasn't just talking about sunflowers. At Lincoln Elementary, Miss Hayes had implemented changes that would outlast her teaching career. The Wellness Wednesday program had expanded school-wide. Other teachers were learning to recognize the signs of children carrying burdens too, heavy for small shoulders. The nurse's office had become a safe haven where children could speak truth without fear. "I learned that it's okay to tell when something hurts," 9-year-old Leia told the school counselor during a routine check-in. "And that grown-ups who really love you want to help you feel better, not tough it out." The counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, smiled at this child who'd become an unexpected teacher. And how does that feel, knowing you can ask for help? Safe, Leah said without hesitation. It feels really, really safe. Dr. Martinez's final follow-up appointment with Leah came on a Tuesday morning in late April, almost exactly 6 months. After that terrible day when she'd collapsed in Miss Hayes' classroom, the X-rays showed what everyone hoped to see: clear margins, healthy tissue, no signs of recurrence. Medically speaking, you're perfect, Dr. Martinez told Leah, who beamed at the word perfect, while understanding that it meant something different now than it used to. But more importantly, how do you feel? Leah considered the question with the seriousness she'd learned to bring to all questions about her well-being. Strong, she said finally, but not the kind of strong that means I can't ask for help. The kind of strong that means I can help other people ask for help too. Dr. Martinez looked at Jason, saw a father transformed by love and humility. Mr. Monroe, in 20 years of pediatric medicine, I've never seen a family change the way yours has. You've not only saved your daughter's life, you've probably saved dozens of others. Jason's eyes filled with tears. He no longer tried to hide. Doc, my daughter saved all of us. We just finally learned how to listen. Some stories end with, and they lived happily ever after. But this story? It ends with, and they lived honestly ever after, which turns out to be the same thing. Just more complicated and infinitely more beautiful. 5 years later, Leah Monroe stood at the front of another classroom, not as a student this time, but as a guest speaker. 13 years old now, confident in the way the children become, when they've learned early that their voices matter. She spoke to a health class about advocacy, about speaking up for yourself and others, about the difference between being strong and being silent. The teenagers listened with the kind of attention that comes when someone your own age tells you truths that could save your life. I almost died because I thought asking for help meant I was weak, she told them. But you know what's really weak? Staying silent when your body is trying to save your life. Staying quiet when someone you love is suffering. Pretending that being tough is more important than being honest. The questions came quickly. How did you know something was really wrong? How did you find the courage to speak up? What would you tell someone who's scared to ask for help? Listen to your body, Leah advised. It's always trying to tell you something. And find grown-ups who make it safe to tell the truth teachers. Parents, doctors, counselors. They exist, I promise. You just have to be brave enough to keep looking until you find them. After her presentation, a girl approached her, maybe 14, with the careful way of moving that Leah recognized from her own past. My mom says I complain too much, the girl whispered. But my stomach hurts all the time, and she says I'm just trying to get out of school. Leah took the girl's hands, looked her in the eyes with the intensity of someone who'd stood at the edge of losing everything. What's your name? Emma. Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your pain matters. Your feelings matter. You matter. And if your mom won't listen, we're going to find someone who will. Right now. That afternoon, Jason picked Leah up from school and found her quieter than usual. Not the scared quiet of her childhood, but the thoughtful quiet of someone processing important experiences. How did it go today, little sparrow? Good, Daddy. Hard, but good. I think I helped a girl named Emma. She's hurting the way I used to hurt. Jason pulled into their driveway, the same gravel drive where he'd once rushed to the hospital, terrified and angry. Now it felt like sanctuary. You know what I'm proud of? What? You didn't just help her. You believed her. That's going to make all the difference. The front door opening. The sound of family gathering for dinner. Mary, now 75 and still making biscuits at dawn, looked up from setting the table as they walked in. How are my favorite people doing? Really good, Grandma, Leah said, settling into her chair, the same chair where she'd once hidden her pain now the place where she shared her victories. I told some kids about speaking up when you're hurting, and Daddy and I helped a girl who needed someone to believe her. Mary nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see seeds become forests. That's what we do now, isn't it? We listen, we believe, we help. The clink of dishes being passed around a table where honesty was served with every meal. During dinner, pot roast and vegetables from Mary's garden. Conversation that flowed like a gentle river. Leah shared the details of her day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this family had learned that sharing burdens made them lighter, not heavier. Evening settling over a house where truth lived comfortably. That night, as Jason tucked his daughter into bed, a ritual he'd continued even as she grew older, because some traditions are too precious to outgrow, Leah asked him something that made his heart pause. A child's voice in the soft darkness of bedtime confidences. Daddy, do you think other families can learn what we learned, even if they don't almost lose someone first? Jason smoothed her hair, thinking about all the families they'd met over the years, all the children who'd learned to speak up, all the parents who'd learned to listen. I think so, baby girl. I think stories like ours, they plant seeds. And seeds grow, even in ground that looks too hard for anything to take. Root, the sound of a kiss on a forehead. A father's whispered blessing. Sleep tight, little sparrow. Tomorrow we'll plant more seeds. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Leah. More than all the sunflowers will ever grow. A gentle sound of a house settling into peaceful sleep. There you have it, friend. The story of how a little girl's courage to finally complain saved not just her own life, but taught a whole community how to love better. How fear disguised as strength nearly stole a family's future. How truth, once spoken, spreads like seeds on spring wind. The crackle of dying embers. Night sounds settling in around the storyteller. You might wonder why I chose to tell you this particular tale on this particular night. Truth is, every one of us is carrying something, some pain, some fear, some burden we think we have to bear alone. Every one of us has learned to stay quiet when we should speak up, to appear strong. When we should ask for help. A pause. The sound of wisdom being offered like a gift. The Monroe family learned something that changed everything. Love isn't about protecting people from the truth. It's about making it safe for them to speak it. Strength isn't about handling everything. Alone, it's about building connections strong enough to hold you when you can't hold yourself. Wind through trees. The eternal sound of growth and change. So tell me, before you go back to your own life, your own family, your own carefully guarded silences, what seeds are you carrying? What truth is trying to grow in the soil of your heart? And who in? Your life is waiting, maybe without even knowing it, for permission to bloom? The sound of a chair creaking as an old man leans forward, voice dropping to the intimate tone reserved for the most important truths. Because here's what I know. After all these years of collecting stories and sharing them, we're all just sunflowers trying to find our way to light. Sometimes we grow crooked. Sometimes we start in poisoned ground. But if we're brave enough to keep turning toward truth, toward love, toward the people who make it safe to be human. A long pause. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls to its mate. Well, friend, that's how gardens grow. That's how families heal. That's how children learn they matter, and grown-ups remember what love really looks like. The fire settles lower. The story draws to its close. So go on now. Go tend your own garden. Water the seeds of truth with courage and honesty. And remember, every time you make it safe for someone to speak their pain, you're doing what Leah Monroe did that day in Miss Hayes' classroom. You're choosing connection over silence. You're choosing love over fear. The final sounds. Embers settling into ash. Footsteps walking away into the night, carrying healing stories like treasures in their hearts. And that, child, that's how the world changes. One honest conversation at a time. One listened to complaint at a time. One family learning to love out loud. One sunflower turning toward light. Silence. Then, soft as a prayer, the old man's final words. Now go. Go and plant something beautiful. The story ends, but the echoes continue in every parent who learns to listen. Every child who finds their voice. Every family brave enough to choose truth over silence. The harvest continues, spreading like love itself, endless, generous, and forever growing toward the light. Good, Daddy. Hard, but good. I think I helped a girl named Emma. She's hurting the way I used to hurt. Jason pulled into their driveway, the same gravel drive where he'd once rushed to the hospital, terrified and angry. Now it felt like sanctuary. You know what I'm proud of? What? You didn't just help her. You believed her. That's going to make all the difference. The front door opening. The sound of family gathering for dinner. Mary, now 75 and still making biscuits. Dawn looked up from setting the table as they walked in. How are my favorite people doing? Really good, Grandma, Leah said, settling into her chair. The same chair where she'd once hidden her pain, now the place where she shared her victories. I told some kids about speaking up when you're hurting. And Daddy and I helped a girl who needed someone to believe her. Mary nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see seeds become forests. That's what we do now, isn't it? We listen. We believe. We help. The clink of dishes being passed around a table where honesty was served with every meal. During dinner pot roast and vegetables from Mary's garden. Conversation that flowed like a gentle river. Leah shared the details of her day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this family had learned that sharing burdens made them lighter, not heavier. Evening settling over a house where truth lived comfortably. That night, as Jason tucked his daughter into bed, a ritual he'd continued even as she grew older, because some traditions are too precious to outgrow. Leah asked him something that made his heart pause. A child's voice in the soft darkness of bedtime confidences. Daddy, do you think other families can learn what we learned, even if they don't almost lose someone first? Jason smoothed her hair, thinking about all the families they'd met. Over the years, all the children who'd learned to speak up, all the parents who'd learned to listen. I think so, baby girl. I think stories like ours, ... they plant seeds. And seeds grow, even in ground that looks too hard for anything to take. Root, the sound of a kiss on a forehead. A father's whispered blessing. Sleep tight, little sparrow. Tomorrow we'll plant more seeds. I love you, Daddy. I love you too. Leah, more than all the sunflowers will ever grow. The gentle sound of a house settling into peaceful sleep. There you have it, friend. The story of how a little girl's courage to finally complain saved not just her own life, but taught a whole community how to love better. How fear disguised as strength nearly stole a family's future. How truth, once spoken, spreads like seeds on spring wind. The crackle of dying embers. Night sounds settling in around the storyteller. You might wonder why I chose to tell you this particular tale on this particular night. Truth is, every one of us is carrying something, some pain, some fear, some burden we think we have to bear alone. Every one of us has learned to stay quiet when we should speak up, to appear strong, when we should ask for help. A pause. The sound of wisdom being offered like a gift. The Monroe family learned something that changed everything. Love isn't about protecting people from the truth. It's about making it safe for them to speak it. Strength isn't about handling everything. Alone, it's about building connections strong enough to hold you when you can't hold yourself. Wind through trees. The eternal sound of growth and change. So tell me, before you go back to your own life, your own family, your own carefully guarded silences, What seeds are you carrying? What truth is trying to grow in the soil of your heart? And who in your life is waiting, maybe without even knowing it, for permission to bloom? The sound of a chair creaking as an old man leans forward, voice dropping to the intimate tone reserved for the most important truths. Because here's what I know. After all these years of collecting stories and sharing them, we're all just sunflowers trying to find our way to light. Sometimes we grow crooked. Sometimes we start in poisoned ground. But if we're brave enough to keep turning toward truth, toward love, toward the people who make it safe to be human. A long pause. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls to its mate. Well, friend, that's how gardens grow. That's how families heal. That's how children learn they matter, and grown-ups remember what love really looks like. The fire settles lower. The story draws to its close. So go on now. Go tend your own garden. Water the seeds of truth with courage and honesty. And remember, every time you make it safe for someone to speak their pain, you're doing what Leah Monroe did that day in Miss Hayes' classroom. You're choosing connection over silence. You're choosing love over fear. The final sounds? Embers settling into ash. Footsteps walking away into the night, carrying healing stories like treasures in their hearts. And that child, that's how the world changes. One honest conversation at a time. One listened to complaint at a time. One family learning to love out loud. One sunflower turning toward light. Silence. Then, soft as a prayer, the old man's final words. Now go. Go and plant something beautiful. The story ends, but the echoes continue in every parent who learns to listen. Every child who finds their voice. Every family brave enough to choose truth over silence. The harvest continues, spreading like love itself, endless, generous, and forever growing toward the light. Good, Daddy. Hard, but good. I think I helped a girl named Emma. She's hurting the way I used to hurt. Jason pulled into their driveway, the same gravel drive where he'd once rushed to the hospital, terrified and angry. Now it felt like sanctuary. You know what I'm proud of? What? You didn't just help her. You believed her. That's going to make all the difference. The front door opening. The sound of family gathering for dinner. Mary, now 75 and still making biscuits. Dawn looked up from setting the table as they walked in. How are my favorite people doing? Really good, Grandma, Leah said, settling into her chair. The same chair where she'd once hidden her pain, now the place where she shared her victories. I told some kids about speaking up when you're hurting. And Daddy and I helped a girl who needed someone to believe her. Mary nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see seeds become forests. That's what we do now, isn't it? We listen. We believe. We help. The clink of dishes being passed around a table where honesty was served with every meal. During dinner pot roast and vegetables from Mary's garden. Conversation that flowed like a gentle river. Leah shared the details of her day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this family had learned that sharing burdens made them lighter, not heavier. Evening settling over a house where truth lived comfortably. That night, as Jason tucked his daughter into bed, a ritual he'd continued even as she grew older, because some traditions are too precious to outgrow, Leah asked him something that made his heart pause. A child's voice in the soft darkness of bedtime confidences. Daddy, do you think other families can learn what we learned, even if they don't almost lose someone first? Jason smoothed her hair, thinking about all the families they'd met. Oh, good, Daddy. Hard, but good. I think I helped a girl named Emma. She's hurting the way I used to hurt. Jason pulled into their driveway, the same gravel drive where he'd once rushed to the hospital, terrified and angry. Now it felt like sanctuary. You know what I'm proud of? What? You didn't just help her. You believed her. That's going to make all the difference. The front door opening. The sound of family gathering for dinner. Mary, now 75 and still making biscuits. Dawn looked up from setting the table as they walked in. How are my favorite people doing? Really good, Grandma, Leah said, settling into her chair. The same chair where she'd once hidden her pain, now the place where she shared her victories. I told some kids about speaking up when you're hurting. And Daddy and I helped a girl who needed someone to believe her. Mary nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see seeds become forests. That's what we do now, isn't it? We listen. We believe. We help. The clink of dishes being passed around a table where honesty was served with every meal. During dinner, pot roast and vegetables from Mary's garden. Conversation that flowed like a gentle river. Leah shared the details of her day, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this family had learned that sharing burdens made them lighter, not heavier. Evening settling over a house where truth lived comfortably.